Jia Dao seeking a hermit but not finding him. Beneath the pines, I asked his servant boy. The master is gone, out picking medicinal herbs. He's somewhere in these mountains, deep in the clouds, but I couldn't say where. So we continue with another pentasyllabic quatrain, and we continue with another poet that is only represented by this poem in this anthology. Now, as opposed to some of the others, I do know who Jia Dao was, and he was certainly one of the most important mid-Tang poets, I think, just below Bai Juji and perhaps Han Yu, but probably on the same league as Yuan Chen, Meng Jiao, and himself. Now, remember, Meng Jiao was not very well represented in this anthology in correspondence to what today would be his critical appraisal. Jia Dao is only represented by one poem, this one. And there is, I think this anthology, I've mentioned it a lot of times before, I think the anthology is pretty objective, at least it's pretty canonical or conventional in its choices, but there are a couple of biases. One of them is there is an anti-Buddhist priest poet bias, which means that they either don't appear or that if they appear, like Jia Dao or Jiao Ran, they are generally only represented by one poem or so. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about Jia Dao. I've already said that he was a mid-Tang poet. He was born in 1779, pretty close to modern-day Beijing, in what was then the province of Zhou. And an interesting thing about him is that he became a monk very young, but also quite unusually, he quit monkhood in about 810 and became a follower of Han Yu, following him from Luoyang back to the capital Chang'an, which was the place where he spent most of his lifetime. Now, Jia Dao tried to take the examinations many times. He failed at that, even though he had the sponsorship of Han Yu and other important, prominent men of his day. But he did get a reputation as a relatively good poet. And he wandered about. He spent some time in Chang'an, but he also traveled to the provinces. And late in his life, he managed to get a few minor appointments as assistant magistrate, administrator of granaries, things like that, in charge of revenue sections, very minor posts. His reputation was in this genre. He was reputed to be a master of the five-word quatrain and regarded in it an equal of Meng Jiao. But the reputation of both has been seriously hampered by the opinion of a Sung Dynasty poet, Su Shi, who is arguably one of the best Chinese poets of all time, definitely of the classical tradition. It would be difficult to decide between Du Fu, Li Bai, and Su Shi, who is the most canonical, who would be the top place. But the three of them would be gold, silver, and bronze medals in any canon of classical Chinese literature. So Su Shi, for whatever reasons, disliked both Meng Jiao and Jia Dao. In fact, he said very famously in a poem of his that he disliked the coldness of Meng Jiao, the hunger or the leanness of Jia Dao, and these comments probably have contributed negatively to his reputation in the ages. Okay, so moving on to this specific poem of his, Seeking a Hermit but Not Finding Him. The topic is pretty conventional. We've encountered it at least 2 or 3 times, I think, already in this anthology. So it's a subgenre of visiting recluses, of scholar officials abandoning temporarily the world for some chit-chat with priests or sages living in the mountains. So a subgenre of that subgenre is you do not encounter the recluse. So the scholar official goes to see the recluse, but he doesn't find him. One can imagine that some of these poems are notes, like written perhaps in a piece of paper or on a wall of the hut of the hermit, as a sort of, visitors' cards, like, I didn't find you here, but I came here, and I leave you this little memento, this little present, in the form of a poem. And generally, a characteristic of these sorts of poems is a sort of reflexive melancholy. And sometimes the idea that even though the visitor did not get to meet the recluse, the sage, just by being in his surroundings or looking for him, he gets some sort of illumination, some sort of connection to the way that he was probably trying, at least in theory, to achieve by making the visit in the first place. And now I would say that is only present very ambivalently, very indirectly in this poem by Jia Dao. So the poem is about that. The topic is visiting a recluse, not finding him. And a subcurrent that is implied is the complete otherworldliness and superiority of this unnamed hermit who is being visited, who floats amidst the clouds and remains out of sight, like the Tao for the Taoists, or there's the truth is always inexpressible in words and is always beyond human reasoning and human language. So in some way it is difficult to achieve, although those Taoists would paradoxically also say that it's the natural truth which should be relatively easy to acquire. Okay, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet. So the poem, first of all, is articulated through one sentence. The first line is question, and then the next three lines are answers. It seems to be one question, the one that Jia Dao makes, but based on the answers of the servant boy, it feels like it was three questions, like, is the master at home? Where is he? Can you tell me where exactly I can find him? Because those are the three answers the servant boy gives. The second line says, the master is not here, the master is doing whatever. The second line is where is the master? Well, somewhere in the mountains. The third line is where precisely, or you could imagine that the third and fourth lines, but you could imagine the third and fourth lines are answering the same question, so it would be two, where is he? With the first line being the general description, he's in the mountains, and the next line being a more specific in being unspecific, because, the servant boy says he's amidst the clouds, but I couldn't say specifically where he is. Okay, so as I said, let's take a look at the couplets. First couplet. Beneath the pines I asked his servant boy. The master is gone, out picking medicinal herbs. So first thing, this is a quatrain, so, images have to be, very succinct, very brief, because we don't have that many words to describe the way to the hermitage or its surroundings. The only surroundings that we don't get the hat or anything, we just get the pines. So pines are associated, with mountains, with longevity, evergreenness. They have a dense symbolism. Also with sagehood, like Confucius in the Analect says that only in winter, when only the pines and the cypresses preserve their green leaves, only then is their greenness appreciated, which in his context is a metaphor for the sage who suffers adversity and bad luck. Only when tested by bad luck does a person who is truly virtuous show that virtue and that superiority of character that we expect on such sorts of people. So beneath the pines, and we might imagine that beneath those pines there is the hut in which the hermit lives. Beneath the pines I asked the servant boy. So the servant boy, probably a disciple or a follower of the hermit. We don't get the question. We get that the servant boy was asked. We get now in the next three lines the answer. So the second line, which is still part of the first couplet, the master is gone, out picking medicinal herbs. So the master is not at home. What is he doing? He's picking medicinal herbs. So this is a typical thing that hermits do. In the mountains, they collect food. They harvest. They don't, cultivate food as such. They live out of roots and nuts and fruits and whatever they can pick up in nature. But not only do they search for food, especially if they are of a Taoistic inclination, they seek for herbs and magical mushrooms that should be used in the creation of elixirs, which might guarantee to the Taoist sage long life or perhaps even immortality. So the master has gone picking medicinal herbs. He's, probably a Taoist, not necessarily, but it's possible. And he's picking herbs, medicinal herbs. second couplet. So the second couplet continues the explanation of the servant boy. Again, as I said, this might be the answer. The first answer was, where is the master? Or what is the master doing? A second, and even a possible third question is, where is he right now then? Where is he doing that? He's somewhere in these mountains, deep in the clouds, but I couldn't say where. So, of course, the servant boy doesn't know where he is. He knows he hasn't left the mountains, so he's somewhere up here in all this mountainous range, probably high up in the clouds. So, the mountains would have different elevations. He imagines that the hermit is probably amidst the clouds in the higher areas. Remember, clouds are also symbolic. Here the clouds would seem to hide away the person of the sage, which means it would be pointless for Jiadao to search for him. But at the same time, clouds are frequently used as metaphors for hermits, for scholar officials who quit the world and its ambitions. Although here I would put the emphasis on the non-traceability of the hermit, which creates an image of him as, he's an already transcendent guy. When Taoist hermits managed to purify and refine their natures and become immortal, they generally went floating off to heaven, and they lived in the sky amidst the clouds or amidst the stars, developing wings and turning the material substance into something crystalline and pure. So being deep in the clouds, evokes this idea that, the sage has just floated away off into the clouds and into the Taoist heavens. Or it might evoke another image, which is, that this sort of sagehood represented in the hermit himself, in his physical persona, is unattainable for Jiadao. Jiadao, who after all renounced the Buddhist world and went back to the world of ambitions and of the pursuit of poetry and other frivolous attainments. So in a way, Jiadao might be very indirectly reflecting or pushing forward the idea that the real abandonment of the world and the hermit life is beyond him. Even though he might try a little bit to reach it, it is actually beyond his grasp. So, simple poem. I think it's a very well-known poem by Jiadao. It's one of his most famous pieces. And I didn't find it that lean or that cold. So, I would allow myself some discrepancy with Sushi, and I consider it a very dignified contribution to this anthology.